Welcome everyone to this session, Gender and Resistance. It is one of our book salons, and so we're very excited about it. I'm going to share my screen and we will share the land acknowledgement and get into the conversation. Founded in 1889, the University of New Mexico sits on the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia, the traditional peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, since time immemorial, have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of the land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples. We gratefully recognize our history. So we have a few ground rules for today. We encourage everyone to listen actively, to communicate in a non-judgmental fashion. Don't be afraid to respectfully challenge one another by asking questions, but refrain from personal attacks. Use I statements, speak from your own experience, practice cultural humility, maintain confidentiality. There's no one right answer. And the goal is not to agree, but to gain a deeper understanding. Finally, we ask that you mute your mic when you're not speaking, and when you are, remember to share the mic. And so the next slide gives you a sense of those responsible for this session. We want to thank Barrett Katuna, our executive officer, and as well as Ghassan Moussaoui and Steph Schuster from the SWS Book Salon Subcommittee. I will be moderating, Assata Zerai from UNM. And then we have three authors whose work we will celebrate today: Joe Reger, Maxine Craig, and Julie Shayne. So we'll share their bios next. And this is the outline of our discussion for today. After sharing their bios, we will have 3 questions in 3 parts. In part 1, authors will individually answer a set of questions. And then part 2, we will have popcorn style questions to the authors. And then finally, we will have questions from the co-panelists to each other before opening it up to Q&A from the audience. So we'll go to Dr. Jo Reger's bio. She's a professor of sociology and chair of her department at Oakland University in Michigan. Dr. Reger studies social movements and gender and is the author of Everywhere and Nowhere: Contemporary Feminism in the United States. And she's the editor of Nevertheless, They Persisted: Feminisms and Continued Resistance in the U.S. Women's Movement, as well as Different Wavelengths: Studies of Contemporary Feminism in the United States. And she's co-editor of Identity, Work, and Social Movements. Her work on the U.S. women's movements has appeared in a variety of journals, including Gender and Society, Qualitative Sociology, Feminist Formations, the Journal of Contemporary Ethnography, and Social Movement Studies. And so join me if you have your reactions out in welcoming Dr. Reger. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Maxine Craig, who is professor and graduate program director in the sociology department at the University of California, Davis. She studies the politics of beauty and the ways in which social structures of race, gender, and class are lived in day-to-day embodiment. She received her doctorate in sociology from the University of California, Berkeley. She is author of Sorry, I Don't Dance: Why Men Refuse to Move, and Ain't I a Beauty Queen? Black Women, Beauty, and the Politics of Race. And she's the editor of the Routledge Companion to Beauty Politics. So join me in welcoming Dr. Craig. Yay. And then our final author is Julie Shayne. Dr. Julie Shayne is the teaching professor in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at the University of Washington, Bothell, where she co-founded and presently coordinates their Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies program. She is author and editor of 4 books. Her first three are about revolution, feminism, and social movements in Latin America and the diaspora. And her most recent, the focus of today's Salon, is an interdisciplinary open access collection called Persistence is Resistance, celebrating 50 years of gender, women, and sexuality studies. So join me in welcoming her with your reactions. And then we will move on to the first set of questions. So I will read the questions. Each author will have about 6 to 7 minutes to answer these questions. For the first minute, they have each shared with us some slides that, we get to see their book cover as well as information on ordering the book and other information they decided to share on the slide. So for the individual that's helping me, if you could just show that for about a minute, and then we will turn off the slide deck and turn it and see the beautiful faces of our authors. And so these are the questions. What is your book about? What inspired you to write it? How does your work connect to gender or gender theory? What intersections inform your book? And finally, how did feminist praxis inform your approach to the project? And so I will put those questions in the chat just so that you have them right there at your fingertips. And so how about if we just go in order and invite Dr. Reger to answer the questions.
I totally forgot that I had to unmute myself, so.
Oh, right.
I've only done this for 2.5 years. Well, first of all, let me say thank you. I'm very pleased to be here tonight, and I love this opportunity to hear about other books, but also to get a chance to talk a little bit about my book. So let me first say what this book is about. And so what I see this book as really a comprehensive way to try to look at how gender and social movements intertwine and shape each other. And so I really look at an extensive literature review to look at how gender as a sorting mechanism shapes how people fare in social movements. So I'm really thinking about gender in a variety of ways, but the first way is kind of at the structural societal level and how people are shaped by it. So I start by looking at how gender concerns can shape specific gender-specific movements like women's movements or men's movements, and then examine how gender shapes movements made up of both men and women, so multi-gender movements and how gender is still a part of that. And then I move on to think about how men and women really can fare very differently in the same movement. And so I try to look at that through the lens of how they come into movements, the way in which they're recruited, the networks that they have are different, the way in which they frame what their interests are, what their goals are, and spend a chapter looking at how tactics, strategies, and who assumes leadership happens in movement. So I try to move from looking at kind of, women's movements and men's movements, which is where we often stop when we think about gender and social movements, and move into thinking about how gender is really enmeshed in so many other ways. And while I see gender as a binary that really shapes people in society and shapes a lot of what happens in social movements, I also try to look at how movements often change societal dimensions and definitions of gender and allow for the expression of more gender and non-gender identities. So one of the chapters I try to look at what's happened in the LGBTQ movement. I try to look at what's going on in the trans social justice movement. And at the same time, I look at how, as social movements combined with women and gender studies programs, sociology programs, begin to change the way we think about gender, there's backlash against that. And I focus on some of the things that have been happening, Judith Butler being burned in effigy in Brazil for destroying, the structure of the family, what's going on in Hungary, getting rid of gender studies departments, and trying to kind of intertwine all of that with the way in which gender shifts and change over time. So this book was largely written to be used in kind of an advanced undergrad class. But I'm finding that a lot of people are really enjoying the fact that there's a lot of literature in here. So I see graduate students are looking at it, but also the fact that we're looking at gender in multiple ways and not just looking at gender in terms of the movement. People are finding that really interesting. The way I got started with this book, well, and for anybody here who's ever been to a conference, a lot of times you have publishers that ask to meet with you. And so they asked me to think about writing a book, and they wanted me to write a book on women's movements. And I wanted to do something I thought that really took it a little farther than just women's movements in terms of how we think about gender. So this was something that I proposed and worked over time with it. So that was really an idea that kind of came to me. And then as I got into it, I was really happy that I did it. I felt like it brought a lot of my thinking together and helped me kind of think kind of more clearly about things I had really been working on for a long time, but got me to go a little farther. It does definitely connect to gender theory. Gender theory is embedded the whole way through it. And I will say, you know, as a former editor of Gender and Society, I feel really grateful to all the articles that I read, because they really got me to think about gender in very complex ways. That was very useful when I started looking for the research that had been done on gender and social movements. And I will say, there's some holes. You know, one of the things I realized when I wrote this, there's some real gaps where we haven't really looked very clearly in terms of sometimes using a lot of intersectional theory, using that, thinking about gender and, right, and the complexity of gender embedded in other social identities in terms of social movements. So it made me also realize some of the holes in the field that made me kind of excited to think about as we move forward. So I'm not sure how many of these questions I'm supposed to do. So maybe I'll stop right here, and then I'll let everybody else have a chance to talk, and we can come back and talk more later.
Thank you so much, Jo. Next, we turn it over to Dr. Maxine Leeds-Craig. And I think that I can share my screen now. And so we'll give you a chance to take a look at her book cover and invite you to start to answer the questions. Oh, you're on mute, Maxine.
You would think after 2 years of teaching on Zoom, I would have that, but no, I resist learning this. So first of all, thank you, Assata, for the really generous introduction, and thank you to everybody who organized this. So what is this book about? It's about beauty politics. It's a collection that has scholars from many different continents and disciplines writing on how the notion of beauty, the assumption that women ought to want to be beautiful, the assumption that to be a woman is to be beautiful, the political implications of the place of beauty in our lives. So beauty politics, I brought a lot of different things under that umbrella of beauty politics, following the emerging work that's been coming out surrounding beauty. So something that, had I written this a while ago, or had I edited it a while ago, I wouldn't have put quite so much on labor, but people are more and more looking at both the expectations for particular kinds of embodiments, beautiful embodiments at work. Also, Millyanne Kang's work on the labor of producing beauty. So I having a section on labor is a result of me being inspired by the work that's coming out. I worked on a whole section on theorizing beauty politics, because there's been a great deal. So does this draw on gender theory? Absolutely. It wouldn't exist without both gender politics and gender theory. And I guess I put those two together because I think generally most theories that find their way into sociology probably had their origins in social movements. and get kind of prettied up in the academy. And certainly for beauty politics, whether that is the gender politics of beauty politics, or the anti-racist politics of beauty politics, or the anti-ableist, right, the disability politics of beauty politics. All of these came into academia because of the work done by activists outside of and inside of academia. Is it intersectional? I think the reason I really wanted to edit this book was because, and this goes back to my first book, which was my dissertation. I wrote Ain't I a Beauty Queen because I encountered feminist writing on beauty and saw that how much whiteness was centered in that conversation. And I thought if you center Black women in that conversation, that that beauty politics would look very different, and that the meaning of beauty in women's lives would look very different. And so one thing I was sure of about this book is it's not going to center whiteness, either as an ideal or as a subject matter. I think I'm going on here, I don't know, for being editorial, you know, when the question of methods for editorial, I might have more to say about this, but you know, it comes down to how are you, two things, like which disciplines was I going to engage with? And you'll see my biases in there. There's a bunch of sociologists, and that partly reflects where I'm located and who will say yes to an invitation from me. But I also really wanted to pull in historians. I wanted to pull in philosophers. I'm a little hesitant. Some of the work in psychology on beauty just is so experimental and annoying to me that I did not bring it in. So my biases are there. Asking undergraduates who they find it beautiful in photographs. I think some of that is so problematic that you don't find that in this book. Because very often the very questions I want to explore are built into the assumptions of that kind of experimental work. There I've revealed all my biases. But what it meant then by be truly welcoming a pretty much interdisciplinary book is that I, as an editor, I had to step aside and accept that people write really different ways. And that was an interesting process for me. So I think I will stop there and turn it over to the next person.
Thank you so much, Professor Craig. Next, we invite Julie Shayne to share about her book, and I'll show her beautiful slide that she put together and invite her to start.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you for organizing this, and Assata for moderating it. And I'm actually dropping the link in the chat because it's open access and online, so you can just page through it. So mine is called Persistences, Resistance, Celebrating 50 Years of Gender Women's Sexuality Studies. And the essays are, I describe them like The Atlantic meets Ms. Magazine. They're short essays, not even really chapters. And the first section is about the history of GWSS. And so there's one is about San Diego State, because that was the first program. And there's one about the first and only Africana Women's Studies program, which is at Clark Atlanta. There's something overview of global GWSS in the Global South, an annotated bibliography about GWSS in the Americas, something about the name change in the discipline, and then something about why GWSS still matters so much. And then the second section is about the praxis of GWSS, which I kind of thought about that as the ability of GWSS to bring structural change, and even at a micro level. So there's two pieces about feminist pedagogy, one about the healing power of Africana women's studies, something about feminist publishing outside of academia, barriers to women of color still in academia, the importance of feminist administrators, and what GWSS alum can do with their degrees. And then the last section, I called it Doing GWSS. And there's one piece, the first piece in that section is written by a GWSS student. And then, or she's probably graduated now, and then gender studies in Ghana, feminisms in Latin America, indigenous feminism, ecofeminism, GWSS at community colleges, and then a piece about Chanel Miller's Know My Name. And then woven throughout it, I had undergrads answer very briefly why they chose GWSS, and then there's student art and poetry, and I worked with a former student of mine. She illustrated all of the authors, so there's art all the way through. And then, so what inspired me to write the book, I don't remember the initial thing. I never do. They just keep happening. Even though I keep saying after everyone, I'm never doing another book, and this is the fourth one. But I have my BA and MA in women's studies from San Francisco State, and women's studies has always felt like my real home. And I wanted to do my PhD in women's studies, but back then there was like 3 programs, I think 5 actually at the time, and it just felt too risky. But I knew the 50th anniversary was coming up. I had done a lot of research into GWSS programs just because I was one of the ones who founded ours at home at Bothell. I had done a Ms. Magazine workshop at the NWSA about writing for the popular press, and I worked closely with my digital scholarship librarian. And so a lot of the ideas came from the last SWS workshop, and I've already edited a book. I knew how to do that, and just had everything fell into place until the world fell apart. But the ideas all gelled, and I just ran with it. In terms of how gender theory run through it, I mean, it's obvious. I'm telling the story basically where gender theory is in the academy, and I think it's really important for us to just stop and pause and basically thank the activists who created this discipline that did not used to be here. And it's the result of activists, as Maxine was basically saying, and that's super important to be talking about and thinking about. What intersections inform the book? All of them: race, gender, ethnicity, place, nation, environment, age, class. It's all about privilege and power in general. I mean, I think that's what GWSS is about at its best, if it's done right. I was very intentional about this not being a white US-centric history of GWSS. I went to San Francisco State. That was a very Black feminist, women of color feminist department, very transnational. Interpol Graywall was there when I was still there. When I started reading some of the histories of GWSS or women's studies, they were very white, and I was quite taken aback because it was not reflecting the reality that I knew, and it was really disconcerting. And I was very committed to making sure this book reflected the intersectionality that I know GWSS is, and not just by using the word intersectional, but having the project really reflect it with who the authors are and what the content of the essays are. In terms of feminist praxis, if we understand praxis as being mobilizing theory, to me, that's what this book is. It's supposed to embody 50 years of GWSS. It's supposed to teach about it, and it's supposed to recruit students for another 50 to keep us around for 50 more years at least, right? And so that's what my vision was for the book. So I'd look forward to talking about some of the decisions I made as well, because it was very intentional, and sociologists came to my mind a lot.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And so now we're going to go to part 2. So tell us about some of the decisions you made regarding methods. Did your lens as a feminist sociologist guide you in these decisions? Julie, we may ask you to start with that because that's kind of where you ended in your comments just now. 2, writing a book can be exciting, but also a challenging process. What practices helped you to complete this work? So we'd like you to mentor some of the audience a bit on that one. And then finally, question 3, who are some of the audiences of this book, and how do you see them using the work in their subfields, disciplines, or courses? All right, so I'll stop sharing. And Julie, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, sure. So there was a lot of them. The first decision was that I was not going to let there be more white authors than authors of color. And that I accomplished that. And I also didn't want, wasn't going to let there be pieces written by outsiders. So like I wanted something about Indigenous feminism, but I only was going to let an Indigenous feminist write it, that sort of thing, which that ended up being good and bad, because I wanted something about disability studies and GWSS, but I couldn't find a scholar that identified as disabled to write it, so I don't have the piece. So it was, some of those decisions were hard, because I suspect I could have found somebody who considered themselves an expert but was not disabled, but I decided I didn't want to do that. So that kind of decision, at a certain point I had to stop including sociologists, because there were so many of us, and not just because I had put the call through SWS, but I was looking through GWSS pages to find people, and I would find somebody's bio and they looked perfect, and then yet again, it was another person with a PhD in sociology that I didn't know. And, so that after a while, I stopped doing that. I, like I said, I was very intentional that the language had to be non-jargony, and that's very hard for some people to write that way, if depending on where you teach and where you've been brought up, if people allow you to do that. And so it took a lot of effort to basically get the jargon out of some of my authors' pages. I was very intentional about including all the student art and undergrad presence, and that was, if I was working with a real press, I wouldn't have been able to do that. They don't like including undergrads as it is, let alone the way that I let them with their art and everything. So that was fun, and was very intentional about including a cross-section of schools in terms of HBCUs and women's colleges, community college, public. It wasn't an accident that cross-section. And I wanted a cross-section of ranks of the faculty and that are represented, not that I want a teaching track and tenure track, emeritus, and down to undergrad. So lots of those sorts of decisions. Everybody had to be connected to GWSS somehow, not just teaching GWSS courses in whatever they're at, but they had to have their degrees and then be connected to their programs. So there was many different boxes people had to check, but the very first thing that was the most important to me was that there was not going to be more white authors than authors of color.
I love how intentional you were about those decisions. Thanks so much for sharing, Julie. So Joe, Maxine, would you all like to share about decisions you made regarding your methods and how your lens as a sociologist, a feminist sociologist, guided those decisions?
Sure. I'll go ahead if that's okay, Maxine. As a feminist sociologist, part of how I approached this was not looking at kind of objectively at interactions, but identifying places where gender and social movements actually disadvantage the participants and can disadvantage the goals. So this attention to inequality, even when we don't think inequality is happening. So what does it mean to be in an organization in which all the men are leaders and are the ones who are speaking, right? And how do we then understand what leadership is? And is there a way to redefine leadership. And a lot of this comes from like some really amazing scholars, Belinda Robnett and her idea of bridge leaders, looking at the civil rights movement, but constantly having my eye on that. So thinking about when I talk about the LGBTQ movement, making sure that I talk about the divisions within it and the way in which trans social justice is separating, the marginalization of trans activism sometimes in more mainstream gay organizations. And a lot of this comes from the literature, but I wanted to find that literature. So I wasn't just trying to paint a picture, I was trying to show the dynamics. And I think that's what feminist sociologists do. For me too, just thinking about this idea of praxis, and as Julie said, how, like theory meets reality, which is a great way to think about it. One of the things I struggled with is that social movements often sort people in a gender binary that people themselves do not live in. And it's hard to write about that in a way that doesn't make you seem like you're totally into the gender binary or you're ignoring the way in which the gender binary sorts us. So, I thought a lot, and I was really lucky. I started this right as the Black Lives Matter movements were really heating up. And when we got to Portland and the wall of moms, right? Everybody remembers the wall of moms, all the white moms that were in the front, right, in Portland, and then the wall of dads, and they were the white dads that came out. And it was a good reminder to me that even when we try to say that gender is more than a binary, it sorts us by binaries, right? That's how that movement used those binary and really very intersectional white, middle-class white women issues, right? And it was actually done somewhat intentionally by the organizers. So there's all that like amazing complication of how social movements use the reality, and we have these theories that tell us that these realities are problematic, but they're doing that for an outcome, and it's like really juicy stuff. So as a feminist sociologist, I felt like, I couldn't be afraid to try to dig into some of that and to not be afraid to point out in some of the ways in which it is problematic, the way in which movements often use gender identities can be problematic. So I have no methods in the book because it's basically a review and a comprehension of the literature. But I will say that the question about writing a book can be exciting and challenging. It is, and boring and monotonous and something that at some point you don't want to do. And, I would just say for people out there, I actually read books about writing, and that inspires me to read like, how do people write? And not that all of them are really helpful, but it always helps me to understand that other people struggle with writing, and then to write a certain amount. But I will say that one of the most valuable things that happened to this book is that it went out for review, and 2 of the reviewers were quite fine with it. And 1 reviewer disliked much of it. And I was told by the press, well, that's okay. You don't really need to focus on that. And I went back and I looked at why that reviewer too did not like some of the things in the book, or really was pushing me on and a lot of things. And I went back and wrote like another 5,000 words and made the book so much better because somebody really thoughtfully pushed me. Because I think sometimes when you're writing or even editing a book, you go in a direction and then someone's like, hey, did you realize you just did this, right? Did you, Julie's so wonderfully intentional, but sometimes it's hard. You get into a thing where you know where you're going and then you're like, oh, I just realized there's only US scholars on here. There's nothing from, I've completely ignored the rest of the world academically, or I'm only citing sociologists or whatever. So I was really grateful. I can't say appreciated it at the time, but I was really grateful when I finished that that someone had taken the time to really seriously tell me what they thought. And it made me value that process and how your writing can really improve when someone does that. So I'll just leave it there and hear what Maxine has to say.
Thank you so much, Jo. So Professor Craig, we are starting to wade into the questions about how writing can be an exciting or challenging process. So please feel free to answer anything that you want, whether you would like to talk about the methods and how feminist sociology guided them, or if you want to talk more about writing as a challenging process, or both. It's up to you.
Okay, thank you. I think I'll write about editing something as unwieldy as this as a challenging process. And it presents, I was the Gender and Society deputy editor, so I've done like editing in that realm for, years, but editing something like this is different. And the biggest challenge for me is that I couldn't control it in the way I would control something that I was writing. And that is, so you invite people and not everybody you invite wants to be in it, right? So I had a vision of how this would cover, how this, would not be Anglo-American. It is more Anglo-American than I want it to be, even though there's representation. But there's a lot of African feminists who I wish were in this volume who said no. And I get it, because contributing to a handbook like this, is not what they may need to write at this stage in their careers, right? So, yeah, not being able to control it was a lesson for me, like how you deal with what, and then that we were doing this during a pandemic where I watched writers disappear into childcare, and then a year later say, I can't be part of this. Suddenly I have this massive hole in the volume that I, on a really important topic, right? So learning that, I think now that I did this once, I would know how to do it. I attempted with Excel spreadsheets to keep track of which version is this coming in. It was and then I realized, no, I need to print everything out and have big piles. So I had big piles of versions. So all of this was me fumbling through learning how to be on top of a project like this. I think the thing that I'm most happy with about how I did it was I knew what I didn't want to do. I didn't want it to be organized by place, beauty in this place and beauty in that place, even though as I was going international, right? And so I wanted the conversations, and pretty much I was able to keep that sense that it was topical rather than geographical, which was very important to me. And also I didn't want to organize it by body part. But one thing I did do was putting, I think the thing I'm happiest about is that I wanted to shake up people's notions of what kind of body work is so normal they don't think about it, and what kind of body work is extreme that only others do, right? And so the chapter on genital surgery is right there next to the chapter on orthodontics, to make us think about these things across these chapters. So anyway, I'm happy about how that worked. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I love that you put those two chapters next to each other. I didn't notice that when I looked at the book. So yeah, I'm going to have to go back and think about that some more. All right. Well, the last couple of questions for this section are: what writing and editing practices helped you to complete the work? And who are some of the audiences of this book? And what are ways that you see them using it? And so whoever would like to start, I invite you to do so.
I always want to say my dog is what helps me with everything, but mine's cheating because I was on sabbatical, and that's really what allows me to do this. And then the other part of cheating is that I'm on the teaching track, which means that my research expectations are all that means is to stay scholarly engaged, which means keeping myself out there. And it also, I'm already promoted to full teaching professor. So like everything I do in this category is because I want to do it. It's all passion projects, and this stuff is a passion project. But the stuff that what really kept me going with this was that all the contributors, we all got so excited about it, and there was a lot of them because the book is since the essays are so short, there was like, I don't know, I was dealing with 25 people or something, which was a nightmare from an editing perspective. And Maxine, you know what I'm talking about, but there was a lot of those were co-authored. So it's not quite as bad as it sounds from an editing perspective, but that was a lot of good energy also. And so that was very helpful. And my copy editor is a good friend of mine, but she's not an academic. She's what I call a real writer. And she just was like absorbing all the feminism that was coming through the essays, and she was loving it. And so she was like, the energy she would get from it, she'd give it back to me because she was enjoying it so much. And so that was, you know, and then we'd go take walks because it was through the pandemic of pre-vaccine and everything. So we, you know, couldn't be close together, but we're in Seattle and just be in the trees and stuff. So a lot of it was just the energy of the book, and also because we were talking in, you know, in normal speak, not jargon. And so all of that kept us going. And I think it says a lot about loving what you do, you know, like you have to, I tell my students this when they're picking research topics, that pick the right topic because you have no idea how long it's going to follow you around for. And this is, I mean, if I think about it, this book is the product of me doing my undergrad in women's studies, which that was a long time ago now, you know, and I think that's part of what got me through it. So, but also it's partially the no pressure thing of not having to go up for tenure or even more promotions and all that sort of stuff.
So is this a question of audiences? Is that where we are?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And also, what were your writing and editing practices that helped you to finish the book?
Okay, well, audiences, I mean, I find these handbooks, I assign them. I'm just so happy when somebody's written a chapter that summarizes a field, a little bit of a field, and that's what these handbooks are good for. So if anybody looked at the price tag, like, I don't expect any of you to buy this book because it's awfully expensive, but I hope a lot of libraries buy it. And then, you know, and I'm glad I'm already assigning chapters from it to my students to say, oh, I want to, you know, write on Black women and weight. And it's like, okay, I've got a chapter. Read this and you know what's been written already. And so I see this for you know, advanced undergraduates and graduate students who need to know what's been written up to this point on a topic relating to beauty and beauty politics, right? So that's the audience. How did it, you know, how did I finish? I felt, you know, when you're involved with something that involves 30 other people, like, I felt like I owed it to all of them. You know, I created this mess and I needed to see it through to the end. You know, I was sometimes very stressed because it was in the middle of the pandemic, you know, and it was no longer my project. It was this thing that involved all these people. And I have to say, during the pandemic, even though that made it hard, you know, there I was stuck in my house, in this room, doing everything, like, you know, doing like everything from teaching the funerals, like in this room, you know, and then to be in conversation with, you know, someone in Beijing and someone in Sydney was kind of wonderful. And hearing from them, so how are things going in Tokyo, you know, and so that was a really kind of nice thing about doing a book with international authors when I was so stuck at home.
Very nice. Thank you so much, Dr. Reger.
Oh, it's so interesting to hear both of you talk about this, idea of conversation and finding time and, what makes sense. I was able to do this book because I am a full professor at this point. And so the pressure to get something out, quickly and make it, it is off somewhat. And so I had time to kind of have a little more, spend a little more time with it, not feel quite as much pressure. And I realized what an amazing privilege that is to when you get to the point in your career where you can often just kind of pick what you want to do and spend time doing it. So I acknowledge that. I think I write in two ways, two stages. The first stage is my floundering garbage drafts. Does this make sense? Where's it going? What's this chapter really about? I mean, I think I've done that my entire career. I think my dissertation was like that. Everything I've written, it's like the first go through, I'm just like, I think I know what I'm doing, but I'm not really sure. The second part is when I have a clear sense of what I'm doing, and how I finished the book, I think, is that I had a clear sense of where I wanted to go, what I wanted to find. And, I'm looking at this picture of Melanie Heath, who I know is here, like finding, I used her scholarship on hard-boiled masculinity and the Promise Keepers in the book. And so I loved using her work because it was like having a conversation with her, right? Even people I don't know. I love digging into that work, thinking about what they're saying. And it just, even though writing is such a solitary thing, it actually isn't a solitary thing when you're living out all of this in what you're doing. And particularly when it's somebody that you really admire, like I admire Melanie. So, and then there were things that I wanted to go find. And so then it became like a mystery hunt, like who's written something on this, that did this, that, and then I would find all these people I never heard of. So I just started. And I'll tell you, Google Scholar helped a lot because I could put in, Muslim men's socialization into, like whatever I was kind of going down, and I could find things that I don't know how I would have found some other way. And so I love that part of it, like that part of like, oh, I just found that piece that fits just perfect and makes the sense. So, but I can't do that until I write that whole kind of floundering lost draft. So I don't know if that's helpful at all for anybody because it sounds kind of painful. I also write down every hour that I write. So every time I write it, I write the date and the time, and I try to write a certain amount of hours every week when I'm working on a project. And I'll tell you, as stupid as that sounds, I actually get more stuff done when I make myself write it down, because then I actually do it, as I suspect, like many of you, life is very busy and everybody wants something from you, and it's really easy not to write. So I'll just leave that there. But yeah, I think that's how I finish things, is that I have to get to the point where I kind of know exactly where they're going, and I can kind of begin to, smooth it out and make it pretty.
Super. Thank you so much for sharing that. And it's an iterative process for those who haven't written books yet. I put in the chat, it's like that first pancake when you write the first draft. You're just trying to get it out there to figure out what shape it's going to take. And so we have to give ourselves kind of that permission to do that. So now is an exciting time in the discussion this afternoon or evening, depending on where you are in the world. So we would like to invite the co-panelists to ask questions of each other. So based on what you have heard from your co-panelists, do you have a question, comment, or observation for one of them? So I'll stop sharing, and I've already put this in the chat, and I will invite you all to jump in.
I have a question for Maxine. So, and I think maybe the same question for Julie. What was the chapter that you really wanted that nobody's written yet, that would have, like, you really wanted in that volume?
I have two that I wanted. I wanted something about disability studies in GWSS, and I wanted something about trans studies in GWSS. So I mean, I don't know that it's not that they haven't been written, but they definitely, something that's looking at 50 years of GWSS, those are two huge holes that they don't exist in here. I was very sad about that.
I should go back to my original spreadsheet, the things, right? And in some ways I was thinking about, I don't have enough trans scholars in my book, but I also, part of my decision was I didn't want like the chapter on trans beauty politics, right? And so to some extent, like this comes up in the chapter on genital aesthetics, and trans people come up in a chapter on Black hair. So actually I'm dodging the question. I did actually, I kind of started out wanting that chapter and not getting it. I think in some ways it's better because it doesn't, the question of trans embodiment doesn't get squished into one chapter because it shouldn't be. I am sure if I thought longer about the ones I searched for, and I did, that's a great question, and I might come back to it when I go, all right, I should sneak a look at my Excel spreadsheet for the disappointments, the people I went after and I didn't get. Let me say, okay, I know what, like I have a wonderful chapter from Monica Figuera about mixed race, people in Mexico. There's not enough about Latin America in the book, and that is a terrible absence. So yeah, that's a real weakness of the book, and it reflects my location as a US scholar in my networks. And there it is. Yeah.
Thank you for your transparency and honesty. Other questions for each other?
Okay, this one's for Julie. How did you deal? Gender studies departments look very different from each other. There are some that are much more humanities based, and some and much more, and others that are more social science. And how did those disciplinary boundaries play out in putting the book together?
I don't know that it came up really, because we weren't like assessing the field or judging programs or anything. I mean, when I said I was looking at programs and stuff, I would literally go looking at through programs, looking at for authors who could write about trans studies or disability. When I was literally trying to find people that I would send an email to saying, I'm writing this working on this project, would you be willing to? I sent a lot of cold calls, so that's when I would be going through them. It wasn't to be researching them to write about them. So I don't know that it came up so much. I mean, I was definitely aware of it, but yeah, there's, like I said, there's a lot of sociologists. We're everywhere, which I didn't realize it as much until I started what felt like stalking a lot of GWSS programs. That wasn't my intention, but that's what it felt like. But it didn't. I don't think it really affected anything. It was just me trying to find authors.
One final question before we open it up to the audience.
I just kind of want to open it up to the audience, actually.
Okay, then we'll do that. So I am putting it in the chat. You don't really need instructions. You know how to ask questions. So please feel free to just unmute, show us your beautiful pictures, put yourself on the camera so we can say hello. And I see that Melanie has popped up. So would you like to ask a question, Melanie?
Sure, that sounds great. Well, so first of all, thank you, Joe, for the very nice words about my work. Likewise, your work has been so influential in my life, and so I appreciate that. I was really struck by something you had said about reviews, and I, as somebody who writes books and then also mentoring graduate students, it's so tricky to be able to take in reviews that aren't positive, right? And at the same time, it's so important, to be able to think through, what are the holes in your work? And I just thought maybe I would open this up to all the panelists to see, what is the role of review for books in particular? Because I think it has a very different role than it does in journal articles. I mean, in journal articles, it's often so much more focused, but there's this feeling because, the reviewers know who you are. I feel like they oftentimes might be a little bit nicer, right? And I wonder if that's actually more of a negative thing. And I just thought, with Joe saying, it's so important to have those kinds of critical reviews. I just wondered what people thought about that, and how also maybe the next part of that, in terms of mentoring other students, other people, how to help people sort of assess the reviews that maybe shine sort of a negative light on the work.
Are you talking about the reviews when you send your manuscript out to get a contract, or once the book's in print? Or
I mean, it could be either, right? Because I think, you can get, so like when you're sending your book out for a contract, I mean, oftentimes you won't have, a full manuscript, or you have sort of pieces of it. And so I think at that stage, you could get much more negative reviews. When you're sending out the whole book, then there's a question about, sort of, what role do those reviews really play? Is there a tendency to be a little too nice in academia these days? Or I don't know. I'm just interested in people's responses to the whole process of the reviews that come out.
I knew who two of the reviewers were, and just because it's a small world. And then the most critical reviewer is the one that I did not know. And honestly, I've had this reaction with every review I've ever done. They're wrong. This is so stupid, la, 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 la. And I put it away, and then I come back and let myself calm down a little bit, come back and I start reading it. And then I'm like, wow, somebody just saved me or pointed out just places that, that need to be stronger, that could be stronger. And and honestly, as an editor, I also know that one of the things people hate to hear the most is your conclusion could be, your significance could be made a little stronger, make a bigger argument here. And I'm always like, oh, I hate that. But when people tell me to do that, I usually push myself, think a little harder, because I think with book projects, you get tired of it. And at some point you want it to be gone. And then when someone says to you, okay, you need more of this and more of this, and then the conclusion can make a stronger point, and you're just like, oh, I don't want to do this. And then you go back in, you look at what you've done, and you can make it better. And so it's a tough process, and we're all human, and we like to believe that, what we did was perfect the first time. But it's taken me a long time in academia to be like, read it, be upset, walk away, come back, read it again, and realize that, a lot of times I think people give a lot of time and attention to your work. And actually, I'm more upset when I feel like somebody just skimmed it and said it was fine, because I'm like, no, wait a minute. I need, I'm so deep in this. I need you to tell me, where you think I could be better. So I do think it's a tricky thing, but I think there's a lot of emotions in it. But if you can get past that, I think it helps. And I think it's better to get it before it's published than after it's published and you're like, oh yeah, well, that would have been a great idea. I have an edited book, there's a review, and all three of us co-editors were like, well, I wish somebody would have told us that before we did the introduction, like, darn it, nobody, we didn't get enough feedback, and we wanted it later.
I definitely agree with everything that Joe just said. And I think you can also tell when people are just bitter. Like I really don't like reviews. When you get the ones, why didn't they talk about men or something like that? I mean, those reviews, they can just fuck off. Like those are just obnoxious. Or in a lot of my Latin America stuff, this would have been an interesting comparison with Spain. Like, no, I'm not talking about Spain. I'm talking about Cuba, or, things, some of them are just obnoxious. And, and I don't think it's gender and society. There's some journals say when you're writing a book review the book that was written, not the book you wish was written. I forgot who says that. Like, if from that perspective, I think reviews need to be honest, and definitely you want, if you're reviewing a manuscript before it goes out, I would far prefer to get the review the way Joe is saying it. Well, it's a draft before it's in print, but I think it's also obvious when people just have a gripe either, and you can, some feedback is dismissible and some is not. And yeah, this is a business for people with thick skin.
Yeah, if I can follow from, Joe used the word emotion a lot, and I think so much of surviving and thriving in academia is learning how to pick yourself up after rejection of various kinds. I think the most important thing I can tell to any graduate student is that the person, the most successful academic who's written those polished books, that person has received rejection. You have to know that, because particularly for first gen scholars, they get a rejection and the first thing they'll say is, oh, I don't belong. So knowing that getting knocked down repeatedly. So I know Melanie's saying sometimes we do get reviews that are too kind, but the other happens as well. And people need to manage the emotion, figure out how to say, okay, and the ones that annoy me, but then I make use of, are the ones that say I haven't done something that I think I've done, right? So, and which you experience as a misreading of your work. But then what you have to do with that is realize, well, I made it possible to misread my work. So I obviously wasn't clear enough. So go back and be clearer, Maxine. So yeah, I think most reviews, you have to find the kernel of truth in their review, even if it means say what you said more clearly. The other thing is, as someone now I'm going away from this book, but my two other books, like Crossed Fields, I dabble, I'm spreading out into history. And then the Sorry I Don't Dance book was writing about something where people in performance studies and in dance studies write. And so when I first got reviews from historians look at sociologists, they think we're terribly sloppy. And performance studies have their own literature that I wasn't engaging with. And so I am so grateful that editors sent me to those reviewers that were beyond my field so that I would know. I would be less siloed in sociology and know what I needed to read. And also so that I was given a heads up about how this would be read by someone outside of sociology, since I was slipping over the border there.
Yeah, so I learned a lot from your sharing your story, how to make a book and how to make it like published. So interesting. So actually, I now in the dissertation stage, and I still thinking up in the future, working with my colleagues and with the other scholar to like prepare a book to publish or to share what we did in our fields. So, but the most important thing, how you like building a strong team from the beginning to prepare a book to like publish together. So I really interested to hear further about your story, how to prepare it from your early stage of like preparing the idea of the book and then develop it. So yeah, initial stage is, I think that is more important to make it like going on for the next stage. So that's my curious about the process you did it.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
I can speak to that. I think it depends a lot on your relationship with your committee, because my dissertation defense, the whole thing revolved around, I mean, besides whether my dissertation was worthy of me earning my PhD, but was whether the dissertation, what I needed to do to turn it into a book. And my whole committee let me have the whole conversation about what we needed to do next to turn it into a book, and which of their colleagues I could send it to get the feedback from which expert about which section of it and stuff like that. And the debating, should I send it out as is and get the feedback from the external reviewers or revise it first, and all this stuff. I mean, we talked about the content as well, but a big chunk of the defense was around that. And so I obviously don't know your relationship with your committee, but I would start by talking to them. I mean, I know some places committees will let the student write their dissertation as a book and basically let them skip the dissertation language, knowing that every dissertation is ideally going to be a book, but that's obviously up to the committee as well. I mean, I did a presentation for the SWS a gazillion years ago. I think it actually may have been at the New Mexico conference about turning your dissertation into a book. And I'm sure that I can find the handout from that for you if you want, but I would start by getting your committee on board to helping you move it towards a book before it goes too much towards a dissertation.
Thank you very much for your very valuable experience with that. Yeah, I think that like the closest place to keep in touch, that's the committee first, because they know pretty well about what I focus on, what I really doing for my dissertation, and the network in the other college. I think that is also important, same. But you know that learning from your experience is a kind of the most viable how to do it. So I talk something around that, but not sure is it the right track to begin with, you know. So thank you so much for your sharing.
Okay, Dr. Masawa, you have a question?
Oh yes, thank you so much. So lovely seeing you all. So lovely seeing you, Assata. And thank you all for this really generative and exciting conversation. Let me put my hand down. My question is actually directed at Professor Craig and Professor Shayne, if I may, because you both highlighted the importance of interdisciplinarity in sociology, which is not the case. And we're still, some of us, like me, you know, junior scholars, you know, are trying to push that, especially in SWS, gender and society, these spaces. So having both of you actually focus on the importance. So like Professor Shayne's argument that you were looking for people with gender studies backgrounds, which we don't see being published in gender and society, for example, right? It's still super squarely sociological. And like, for example, I can't publish in it. And my book is out with an interdisciplinary editor, never a sociologist. Can you tell us the importance of interdisciplinarity, because you both value it and value it not just performatively. We all watched ASA and we spoke about Du Bois's interdisciplinarity, but at the end of the day, we don't really take Du Bois's work and other scholars of color who actually pushed interdisciplinarity, and it falls back on whiteness and keeping sociology in its way. So if you can tell us more what the value of interdisciplinarity does to both of your works that I'm so drawn to and want to incorporate in my teaching now, and how that helped you form a much more comprehensive, much more accessible and exciting connection, as opposed to only thinking about it through a squarely sociological perspective.
Great question. Thank you.
Maxine, you go first. I keep talking.
Okay, here I go. You know, I was fortunate that my dissertation advisors in my committee didn't work to make me into a conventional sociologist. I just was always told to read whatever was useful. It was always clear to me I needed to read history. But that means that, right, I was not given professional socialization. Don't publish in certain journals, never will. And I've been able to have a career, you know, doing my work. This is why I prefer actually writing a book to journal articles, because journal articles are generally need to follow a certain professional disciplinary model. I find this is a heretical thing to say, but I find most methods sections incredibly boring because they all say the same thing. And it's like, why are they there? You know? And so really writing books, I have never felt those kind of constraints. But if you are in the kind of department that requires you to churn out journal articles in certain journals, it's going to be really hard. It's going to be really hard. You know, the other thing is I've been in social departments and I've been in a gender studies department. What strikes me is, and this is why I asked the question to Julie about disciplines, I was stunned by how some people in the humanities have an absolute disdain for sociology. You know, it goes both ways. So I always teach Butler and Weston Zimmerman right next to each other and say, look, these two ideas emerged in different places, and look at how they're circling around this same level of analysis. You know, but it's incredible that people who read Butler haven't even heard of Weston Zimmerman, right? But I find in books, you've got more room to do what you want. So if you can somehow survive on that, I'll produce something every few years, you know, then you can be who you want to be, do the kind of work you want to do.
Thank you. Thankfully, my tenure home is in gender studies. I am in sociology too, but but thank you so much.
Continue talking about this time anytime.
But you're right. There's a lot of disdain in gender studies for sociologists, and like, but I'm not one of those.
Exactly. I mean, they think we're Talcott Parsons or something. I don't know who they think we are.
Yeah, I'm actually going to be speaking on the presidential panel about interdisciplinarity and feminist sociology or something. I can't remember what it's called, but basically answering what your question is. I haven't written the paper yet, so thank you for that prompt. But I teach at in the School of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at UW Bothell, which is basically like the College of Arts and Sciences anywhere. And then GWSS is one of the majors in it. And we're all like not me and all of our colleagues, we wouldn't even know what anybody's PhD was in, except for when we recruit new faculty and we go around the table and introduce ourselves. We'll say, you know, we have our PhD in sociology from whatever. And I mean, one of my colleagues, we'd been working together for like 8 years before we knew we both had our PhDs in sociology, because we barely teach discipline, we teach content. And so a lot of, I got my PhD in sociology, which I did in 5 years. So I was in the social department there. And then I was at Emory for 4 years, where I was joint appointment in sociology and women's studies. And then that was it. And I left Emory because I couldn't live away from the West Coast. And so I've barely spent, the SWS is really the only time I spend time with sociologists, and these are the sociologists I spend time with. And so I can handle it. But I stopped going to the ASA in 2000. I mean, my intellectual life is completely interdisciplinary, and I teach our core class about what interdisciplinary inquiry is. I love teaching it. And so it's just like, that's the way I think and teach and write and everything. And I'm very, very grateful to be teaching where I teach. And it was a lot of very good timing that it worked out the way it did. And it's my whole campus. It's certainly where I teach, but the whole campus is very sincerely committed to interdisciplinarity, not just in language. I mean, they really mean it, including our deans and everything, our upper administration. Our chancellor right now is a sociologist. Actually, we just hired a sociologist, so that was exciting. So for me, it's a lot of good luck and good timing.
Thank you so much. And I'll be looking forward to the presidential panels. Thank you.
Yeah, I have to write the talk. I'm really nervous about it, partially because I'm going to have to do it through Zoom. So I just have this image of being blasted on a hotel wall, you know, like, as opposed to being in person where it just will be on it. But anyway.
Oh, can I tell people about my cover and why I love it so much?
Yes, definitely. Do you want me to show it?
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. I'm gonna pull it up here.
I'm going to go after you and do the same. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, so this photo, when I wrote the first book, Ain't I a Beauty Queen, and then when you write dissertations, they don't tell you anything about like you will need pictures one day. And so these are all the things you discover afterwards as you're trying to turn it into a book. And I discovered that a lot of the pictures that I wanted to specifically refer to, I couldn't because of copyright issues. And so I went off to the public library in San Francisco, and they had this wonderful collection of photos that were donated by community members to document neighborhoods. And so this was a long, long time ago. And I saw this photograph and I loved it, but it just didn't fit with what I was writing about. But I never forgot this photo. And then when I got to do the cover for this book, I never forgot this photo, and I finally have a place to put it. So this is a photo that came from somebody's scrapbook that they donated to the San Francisco Public Library.
This picture, I just wanted what I wanted to point out is it's the artist who did this. It's the same artist who did the artwork on the cover of both of the Presumed Incompetent books. I don't know if anyone recognized that. And she got she minored in GWSS at Seattle U, and she saw my call through one of the editors of Presumed Incompetent, who's a colleague of mine, and that's how I was put in touch with her. So I thought that was pretty cool.
Do you want to show mine?
Sure. Let me go.
I'll tell you the story of this.
Yeah, there we go.
I hated this. I fought with them so long, and there used to be a woman's shoe on top of the pedestal because I don't know what it was. And I fought and argued and showed it to people. And I finally had a friend who's like, you know, you could get rid of the shoe if you move the green up to the corner because they're trying to balance the whatever. And they went with it. But I'm sure at that point they thought, why are we letting this woman write a book? Because it was horrible. I still really don't like it, but whatever. I stopped them from making the whole thing pink and blue. That was the other thing they tried to do. I was like, please don't do that to me. So, but they put it on the cover of their catalog because they loved it so much. And I was just like, oh, I hate that cover. But there you go. Sometimes you win, and sometimes you just have to go with the best the graphic designer will give you.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for sharing that. All right. Well, I would like to thank everyone. If I can go to the thank you slide. So yeah, we want to just tell you that we appreciate that you've taken some time out of your precious weekend hours, because we know they are very few and usually full of work for most of us. So thanks so much for spending this time at the Gender and Resistance Book Salon hosted by SWS. Your input provides encouragement to our authors, and so we really appreciate that. And authors, your words, ideas, and research edify us all. So thank you, and we wish you a safe and healthy 2002.